During the California Gold Rush, one weapon was so easy to hide that gamblers, thieves, and miners alike all carried one: the push dagger. So today I'm making one out of Damascus. But there's only one problem. I've never made a dagger before. You see, daggers are incredibly difficult to make. That is, to make right. There are multiple planes that all need to align and be symmetrical with each other. One tiny slip can ruin the whole build. In one of my previous videos, I made a billet of Damascus and turned it into a Santoku chef's knife. I had a small piece of steel left over from that, so I'm using it here to forge out the dagger. Normally I would use spray adhesive and spray it onto my pattern and then put it directly on the billet of steel. However, I found that when using the angle grinder and the belt grinder, the steel heats up and it starts to loosen the adhesive and the template peels off. That leaves me with no lines to follow and things can get a little wonky when profiling. So what I'm going to try here is to trace a rough outline of my template on the billet. I'll cut pretty close to that and then I'll use the spray adhesive to attach the template and then grind it the rest of the way to where it needs to be. Using the porter band to cut out the profile here would have been ideal, but I didn't have time to anneal the steel, so I just went ahead and used the angle grinder. I work a unique schedule where I work 3 days in a row, then get 5 whole days off. I work out of state, 3 hours away, so I like to use my shop time wisely when I can get it. A typical 8-day cycle could be fairly busy for me. Usually 50 plus hours at my full-time job, the drive back and forth, unplanned events and social gatherings, plus I'm currently training for a 100-mile mountain ultra. So trying to juggle all that and shop time can definitely be a challenge. This step might seem super simple, but surface grinding the steel perfectly flat is paramount to the success of the later steps that follow. So here's the blade all profiled and surface ground, ready to start put some bevels in it before heat treat. I'm on the fence if I'm going to do a hollow grind or flat grind for this. I've never ground a dagger before, and I've never done hollow grinds before, so I'm leaning towards the flat grind, and then maybe the next dagger I'll work on the hollows. But what I think I'm going to do for this one is do flat grind on the bevels, and then at the plunges I'm going to grind a hollow in with a small contact wheel like that. To kind of give a little bit of a swoop to the plunge and make it flow nicely into the rest of the blade. So yeah, we're sitting at a little over of a 1/4 inch stock. So I definitely want to grind some of the bevels in before heat treat to get some of that mass out and make sure that we get full hardness through the whole blade and save us some of our belts post heat treat. So yeah, that's the plan, and we'll get at it. The cool thing about knife making is it's a bunch of different skills combined into one. You need to know how to weld, how to grind and finish metal, how to grind and finish wood, and there's even a machinist aspect like what I'm doing here, laying out precise lines. It's fun but also a challenge trying to get proficient in each one of these individual skills. And there's always more skills you try to incorporate down the road, like engraving, leatherworking, etc., etc. Eventually, you get to incorporate these skills in other DIY projects outside of knife making. Let's just double check here. Yep, that is center. Like that. So that's center tip. I really can't stress enough how important the initial layout is of these scribe lines. They're going to dictate the overall aesthetics and symmetry of the knife. So if one of these lines is off just by a little bit, you're going to see it in the finished product. And I'm not going to lie, grinding these initial bevels was definitely having me a bit stressed. I've never ground a dagger before, and dagger is different from a regular knife, obviously, because it has 4 bevels instead of 2. So that's double the amount of work that can go wrong, and that's double the amount of area that can look off and not symmetrical. So it's super, super important that I take my time here, pay attention to my layout lines, and grind everything as even and symmetrically as possible. So I'll grind a little bit, stop, check, look in the light, make sure everything's looking straight, and then keep moving forward. Alright, I'm about to quench the blade here, and this part's always a little stressful. Even though I did everything right, I normalized the blade 3 times at a controlled temperature and managed the stresses while I was forging and grinding. It's still a little nerve-wracking because you never know what the steel is going to do. So I'm going to pull it out, going for the quench, and hope for the best. What I'm listening for here, what I'm quenching, is any little tings or pops. Those you don't want to hear. That's usually the steel breaking. So, a lot of people take the blade out way too soon when they quench. You want to let it really cool down in the oil before you take it out. People like to see the big ball of fire. That's not good because your blade's not cooling as effectively if you pull it out too soon. It all affects the quality of the knife. So we should be good here. Stop sizzling. Quick look to make sure it's straight. Yeah, we are looking pretty good, I think. So with the knife heat treated, I now begin the steps of finish grinding. So I start by surface grinding the steel so that everything is perfectly flat and parallel. That'll give me a new reference for a new set of scribe lines to guide my bevels. Once I have everything flat and scribed in there, I move over to the small wheel, the contact wheel, and I grind the transition where the plunges are going to start. This leaves a nice swooping look to the bevel, as you can see there. This is once again a tedious process because the small wheel, one little slip can really cause a dip that you can't grind out, and essentially the knife is ruined at that point. So once again, it's just super slow going. And as you can see here, I did grind a little too far on one side and went past my center line. This is not a huge deal. It's going to make things a little more complicated to finish, but it's something I think I can get out later in the process once I start further grinding the bevels on the flat platen. At this point, I have everything really close to where they need to be. Now it's just a matter of blending and feathering all the lines and bevels together so they come together nicely. So I do that by alternating between the disc grinder, which gets everything perfectly flat. I'll use that small wheel again to help blend in the plunge area. And then I'll also use a platen called the rotary platen, which has a little bit of give to the belt, and that just really helps to blend all my lines together and create everything flowing nicely together. Now just a few small spots to finish up, and then I'm going to cut down the tang a little bit to get it ready for handle fit up. Alright, so here's a quick look at what my plan is here. So, got a nice block of ironwood burl I'm going to use for the handle. So the plan is, knife is going to go into the block like that, which we're really close to where we want to be there. This is a threaded standoff. The plan is to make this a takedown construction, so if any repairs or, down the road, the knife isn't cared for properly, it gets some rust or whatever on it, it could be refurbished pretty easily. So tang standoff is going to go in the back somewhere like that. So I'm going to mill out a slot in the wood here for the tang so it fits pretty seamlessly at the front. Then I mill a slot for that standoff to go into the back, which means that this portion right here, I'm going to have to grind down and thread to a 1032 thread to fit the standoff. So we'll see what kind of luck I have doing that. I've never threaded Damascus before, so I don't know if that's going to cause an issue with the little layers inside, as opposed to just doing it to a mono steel blade, but we're going to find out. I've threaded in the past before, and it's definitely a little tricky with trying to get the blade to be soft enough to thread, but we're going to give it a go. If it don't work, we'll adapt and overcome, but that's the plan for now, so just going to get after it. So again, we're back to the granite block, and we're laying out a set of scribe lines, center lines. What I'm going to be doing here is grinding the end of the tang to fit the 1032 thread for that threaded standoff. This is actually a very precise process because too big and the 1032 tap is not going to cut the threads, or even worse, it's going to create too much resistance and the end of the tang is just going to snap off, twist off. And if it's too narrow, if I grind it too much, the tap, of course, is not going to have enough bite to cut any threads. So this is, once again, a super slow going process. I got to take my time, make sure everything is square, and then I knock the corners off to an octagon, then knock those corners off and begin to round it, and hopefully I have everything exactly where it needs to be. And then what you just saw me do there was soften the end of that area that's going to be threaded. So I just heat it up with a torch until it starts to glow red, and then that should soften the steel enough to where the die I use is able to cut into it. And you really got to buy a good quality tap and die set for this stuff. The cheap tap and die sets you get from Harbor Freight or Home Depot or Lowe's or whatever, just not going to cut it. So once again, this is just super slow going when you're running the die down to cut the threads. A little bit of thread oil goes a long way to help make sure everything cuts nice and clean. So here I got it all finished up. See if it works, see if it threads on, and it does. So I was super pleased that I was able to cut those in. I didn't have to weld an external piece of rod for that nut. So now I'm just grinding the shoulders of the knife where it's going to sit in the handle block. This just carbide file guide keeps everything square and ensures a nice clean fit up. So with everything finished out on the machines, I move over to hand sanding. I begin hand sanding with a EDM stone. This helps keep my lines crisp and flat, and it prevents me from having to constantly tear off to use a fresh piece of sandpaper, which dulls pretty quickly in the initial stages of hand sanding. So once I have everything established and I have most of my machine marks out with the stone, I move on to using sandpaper and my hand sanding sticks because that gives a much better finish. So I'll sand everything to 400 grit, then I'll etch my mark into the blade, and then I'll clean everything up, use just hot water and dish soap, and I'll do my first test etch to see what the pattern has laying underneath the blade. There's one thing I probably should have mentioned earlier in this video, and I'm not 100% sure that we're even going to get a Damascus pattern revealed here. This piece of steel was from the end of my last billet that I made for that chef's knife, and sometimes the pattern does not extend to the ends of the billet because those ends are not worked as much as the center. So that's something I should have checked from the get-go. So I was a little nervous going in for that first etch, but I'm pleased to say that the pattern is alive and well in the steel. With those oxides sanded off, you can really start to see that pattern peeking through here. And if you haven't noticed already, I love my calipers and scribes for laying out and measuring things. You can measure things with a pencil or a pen, but having that nice, sharp, crisp line from a pair of calipers or scribe is just second to none. Next, I'll mill out the top of the block to fit where the shoulders of the knife are going to sit in. I use my Sharpening mini mill for this, and this machine is absolutely great at what it's meant for, and that's light machining. The most I'll use this for is milling out the slot for a bolster or a guard. Other than that, it can't really handle
heavy machining like a full-size dedicated mill would. But it's a made in the USA unit, super accurate and precise if it's used within its limits. And I would definitely recommend it if you're someone like me who doesn't have any shop space for a full-size mill. But what you see me using here is a set of gauge pins to determine if the slot for the tang is the correct diameter. You can't really measure that too accurately with a set of calipers. So if you use the gauge pins and you just slide it in until you find a pin that has just light resistance, then you know that your slot is at whatever diameter or whatever dimension that given gauge pin is. With everything fitting up really well here, last thing I need to do is drill out the back of the block so the head of the standoff sits recessed in there. So now I'll attach my handle template and begin to shape out the handle. One thing to note, when I designed this knife on paper, I folded the piece of paper in half and then drew out half of the knife and then cut that out. And then when I unfolded the paper, I had perfectly symmetrical right and left sides. So I just made a few copies of that, and that is super, super critical so that the entire knife remains symmetrical.
There are definitely a lot better, safer ways of doing this, but safety's not always everything. Just kidding, it is. Desert ironwood is one of the most dense, hardest woods out there, so it's very important that I use sharp belts here. Otherwise, the wood will start to burn, and that's going to be very hard to get out through hand sanding. So sharp belts and a low belt speed is absolutely critical to ensure that everything remains clean and crisp. Here I go again doing another less than ideal sketchy shop practice. I really gotta build or buy a table for my portaband here because this is definitely a good way to slip and cut your finger. But we're careful and we haven't cut our finger yet. Knock on wood. Handle shaping used to be a pretty intimidating process for me, but I've learned since then just kind of take it slow, put good layout lines with the scribe and height gauge, and you just start one step at a time. So first block out the profile, then get your thickness, knock the edges, make sure the edges are knocked off even, and then you just slowly begin to round out the block. And then move on to hand sanding. Now all I do is hand sand to 600 grit, and then I'll buff on a slow speed on the buffer with pink scratchless compound, and that gets most woods, at least most dense and stabilized woods that I usually use, super polished and scratch free. So as you can see here, comes out looking super sharp. So we are nearing the end here. Last thing I'm doing is I'm just doing a quick touch up of the hand finish before I start to do the final etching cycles. I'll touch it up with 1000 grit,
and then I'll clean the blade with hot water and soap. I'll do a few etch cycles. I think I did about 3 for this blade, sanding off the oxides in between. And I'm super happy with how the finish came out. For the final etch, I use a product called Gator Piss, which is an etchant that leaves the blacks black and the silver part shiny. So that's the final etch, and then I will use a piece of that yellow sunshine cloth that you saw there to give everything the final polish. And now I'm just putting everything together, screwing on the standoff in the back there, and it's important too you get the standoff snug but not super tight, like Carl Anderson, who's a famous takedown knife maker, as he always says, you're not tightening the lugs on a F350. So these are small threads and you can easily strip them or break the wood if you tighten too hard. So just go until it's snug and then a little bit more, and that's all you really need. So this knife came together super nice. I'm very pleased with the final results. Last thing I got to do here is sharpen it. I sharpen with a worn 400 grit belt on the grinder on a slow speed. I keep a pretty steep angle for this one. The dagger is not as sharp as it would be for a hunting knife or a chef knife. Really, what you want is just an edge that's going to be robust during piercing, not something that's trying to, slice tomatoes or a piece of paper. So it's sharp, but it's not, razor sharp. And I think that's the ideal geometry for this style of knife.